and integrity meet. Every week, I introduce you to thought-provoking and compelling premier educators, politicians, whistleblowers, best-selling authors, journalists, activists, and celebrities. And they all have one thing in common. They're people of truth and integrity, and many are considered modern-day heroes. And with me today, I have General Robert S. Spalding. He's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute focusing on U.S.-China relations, economic and national security, and the Asia-Pacific military balance. He's the author of the book Stealth War: How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept. He is the Chief China Mongolia Taiwan Division Deputy of Directorate for Political Military Affairs, Asia Strategic Plans and Policy Directorate, Joint Staff the Pentagon, Washington, D.C. As a division chief, he directed activities and operations to develop planning guidance for unified commanders and prepared Joint Staff DoD positions on National Security Council matters, developed informal and formal briefings dealing with major national and international policy matters for use by the chairman and Joint Chiefs of Staff. He is an Air Force command pilot with more than 2,300 hours flight time in two major weapon systems, B-2 Spirit and B-52 Stratofortress. His command of the 509th Operations Group, where he launched B-2s in support of Operation Odyssey Dawn, and military assistant to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Prisoner of War Missing Personnel Affairs at the Pentagon. During the Iraq surge in 2007, he deployed and directed the Personal Security Coordination Center and was responsible for the security of the top 5 leaders in Iraq. He was the Air Force Military Fellow at the Council on Foreign Affairs. So welcome to the show, Bob.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And let's jump right in, as I usually like to. In the book, you wrote in detail about China's takeover. So I'm going to start with a very broad question. How did China take over?
Well, actually, we kind of let them. In fact, it's even worse. We invited them to take over. And that's because we believed that if we made China strong and wealthy, that they would become a democracy like us. And of course, the Chinese Communist Party, after studying the fall of the Soviet Union and really the way that we bankrupted them by forcing them to endure on a very closed economy that was not able to get capital or technology or innovation or talent from the West, the Chinese Communist Party realized that they needed to be connected to us in order to survive, and not only survive, but thrive. And so they did. They connected to us, but they did so in a way that left us believing that they were moving closer to being more of a liberalized political system. And of course, they hid the fact that they, in fact, were probably one of the most ruthless regimes in the history of the world. So essentially, we invited them. They took advantage of it.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, they've violated human rights unlike any other country in history. And I'm just curious, I mean, we know there's a pattern of this. I mean, from them, killing children and only allowing a certain amount of children to be born, what happened in Tibet. And I mean, it goes on and on and on. Hello?
Well, our diplomats would essentially convince themselves that it was worth the effort to look away, to continue to work towards, that, even though they were doing these very terrible things, that eventually they would come around and see the world like we do. And it wasn't that they were completely, the Chinese Communist Party was completely innocent in this exchange, because they said the things that encouraged our diplomats to believe that things were this way. And of course, corporate America loved the fact that they had access to the ability to manufacture in China, where they would subsidize that manufacturing and have very poor labor conditions and very poor environmental conditions. That meant the margins were huge for corporate America. And then, of course, Wall Street was getting warmly rewarded for selling stocks and bonds for Chinese companies. So there were so many people making money, or in other words, and otherwise, being benefited from this relationship, that it just kept going.
Mm-hmm. And one of the most recent atrocities is when China, well, this goes on. This is an expansive comment I'd like to make. So China had forced Italy to buy some of the same coronavirus supplies it had donated to Beijing. And so basically Italy reached out, tried to assist the Chinese, and then they basically stockpiled all these very important masks and respirators and were overcharging people. I mean, it was just unbelievable what I saw. Even on Amazon, I was just looking for some cleaner, some Clorox cleanup. They wanted to charge $50 a container. And I did a little research and found that it led back to China. All this price gouging and taking advantage of people that are desperate is it's unfathomable to me. But then it's a dictatorship. It's a communist country, and one thing I just want to say really quickly, I know there's hate crimes going on against the Chinese, like Chinese Americans. They have nothing to do with it. I mean, even the people in Chinese they don't have a voice. I mean, they even stifle the creativity. They're not allowed to write poems anymore. They can actually go to jail for it. Anything that might show creativity has been made illegal to some extent.
Yeah, and if you look at what happened during the coronavirus, very early on, on January 7th, Xi Jinping said he was in control of Wuhan. Of course, to your point, they were at the same time that they knew that human-to-human transmission was going on, they were pressuring the World Health Organization not to say anything, not to warn the world. And at the same time, we're stockpiling PPE and masks, not only in China, but also outside of China. So it is a very, very, evil regime. But that being said, they subjugate the Chinese people. So it's not the Chinese people or China. A lot of times people use the term China to really mean what when they're talking about the actions of the Chinese Communist Party.
Mm-hmm. And even something that's extremely important with the environment that we're in. It seems like they were selling these quick testing kits and they were substandard, they weren't working, and the prices were increased, and so these tests basically were useless to some capacity.
They were, and this is consistent with what I talk about in my book, is just this very laissez-faire system within China that's essentially encouraged by the Chinese Communist Party. This really requirement that nobody really abide by the rules as long as they're not harming the political position of the Chinese Communist Party. So you can create fentanyl in your factory, you can sell it to the United States and kill tens of thousands of people, as long as you don't challenge the Chinese Communist Party.
Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that's really concerning to me is I've interviewed many human rights activists, including people who've worked for the United Nations, and they shared with me the extent of the problem with child labor and child trafficking and trafficking in general. It's quite extraordinary, and it makes you sick to your stomach when you hear about it. And even to go to some of the manufacturing, you don't even know out there how many things, including our food, that comes from China. And one of the problems, like people have chopped garlic. Most of our garlic comes from, I believe it's 90% comes from China, and they use children and they use people to take the garlic and chop it up and peel it, and it's so bad and so damaging to their hands. They lose their nails and they end up using their teeth, and they're losing their teeth. And I mean, it's unbelievable, actually. I just can't believe the working conditions. And I've seen pictures that were provided to me by the UN, one of the women that I interviewed, and they even chain the children. And I mean, maybe that's past to some extent, but it's hard to say because they really work on marketing themselves as a company that's trying to change and be inclusive of human rights, but we all know better.
Well, I mean, it's so easy for U.S. companies to take advantage of, what the Chinese Communist Party will say, oh, these are just criminals. These are prisoners. So we're going to use them to do labor, and they don't have any rights because they've broken the law. And unfortunately, our companies don't dig deeper to find out, well, the thing that they did was, say they're a Muslim and they wouldn't cut their beard, or they wouldn't drink alcohol, or they wouldn't eat pork, or if they're a Christian, they wouldn't, trade their 10 commandments for the 10 sayings of Xi Jinping, or they were caught having a service in their underground church, or if they're Falun Gong, they were caught exercising, or even in some cases dancing, and they find themselves in jail and then forced into labor. And a lot of these companies are profiting on it, and in a lot of cases helping with the surveillance that goes on. So this is something that we've been doing as a country, and certainly our corporate sector, for a long time, and we should have done something about it a long time ago. Thankfully, we finally are.
Yeah, and there's many reasons not to buy from China. But I tell you, though, because I've been such an advocate for not purchasing in China and trying to make people aware of the inhumane treatment of the Chinese, here's 10 reasons why not to buy in China. Well, human rights abuses inside China and in other nations such as Tibet, Mongolia, and Vietnam. That's all the people there are being affected by the communist rule, and they're not a good global citizen. And if you don't know what to say, I don't know what to say. And the low wages, millions of workers that live in dire poverty. They have no environmental rules, polluting the world basically and endangering all human life. They manipulate its currency to make the goods cheaper at the expense of locally made products, causing joblessness worldwide. And there's piracy of products. I've experienced that myself. Corrupt business practices. They create dangerous products, additives such as lead in toys and dinnerware, melamine in food. And that's the thing. We don't even sometimes realize our food's coming from there. And most of our chicken is coming from there. And these business practices, even they happen in Africa. They promise money to help them, but grabbing the land of the African nations to mine and use as farmland to feed their own mainland China. Harmful fishing practices. Never, ever buy seafood from China, such as bottom trawling, fishing to depletion of the stocks, wasteful practices such as the shark fins. And, anybody who watched Whale Wars saw what was happening. That was also with Japan. And the Chinese traditional medicine, it promotes the use in the body parts from endangered animals such as rhinoceros and tigers. And of course, the wars. And China provides many dangerous rogue countries such as Pakistan with weapons, and is putting armies around the borders with India and other sensitive borders. China is not peace-loving, but is out there to take whatever it can, wherever it can, whenever it can.
Well, it's quite an amazing list, and yes, all of that is just, it becomes overwhelming. It's clear that you've done your homework on China and the Chinese Communist Party, and fortunately, though, starting with the national security strategy that came out in December of 2017, our government has finally begun to not only wake up, but begin to enforce the rules. And that is accelerating in terms of this, what people have termed decoupling between the two economies and the two societies. Because to be honest, to protect the American people from all that you just laid out and really the free world, the only way is to cut ourselves off from what is a very, very dictatorial, autocratic, and technologically sophisticated and economically powerful regime. This is something far beyond what the Soviet Union ever could attain. The Soviet Union's economy was a fraction of where China is today. And certainly, if you look at Russia, just as in comparison to China, Russia's economy doesn't even add up to Texas. So it's really, China's a completely different beast. It really is a new kind of regime that balances, both the economic might of a developed country with the technological sophistication of the United States. And so, and the only reason it's been able to accomplish that is because we've helped them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Why do you think we're still doing business with them?
Well, if you listen to the head of Citibank yesterday, what he was saying is that they've got billions of dollars invested in Hong Kong and China, and they don't want to see that money lost. And so it really is this this willingness to suspend any moral or principled look at China and just look at how much money you can make. And when you do that, it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that while you're making big profits, those profits are supporting the oppression and really the brutalization of many people.
But if we as a country start using our voice and refusing to buy items from China, I don't see, I mean, there's got to be enough of a movement and an awareness. And I think part of the problem is the lack of education and investigation with the people that purchase, the people that buy things in this country.
Well, there's safety in numbers, and I think that's what corporate America and Wall Street have been comforted by, is that there's so much of our supply chain. 90%, 97% of our antibiotics. 90% of active ingredients for pharmaceuticals. 95% of the masks that we needed for to deal with the coronavirus. I mean, there's so much of our supply chain that's in China, and there's safety in numbers in terms of, if everybody else is doing it, it doesn't matter that, whatever I do won't really change things. But more importantly, try as a consumer to go find an alternative for, any number of products, and you're going to have a very difficult time because it's all produced in China. So I think that's what's been going on. Of course, now as companies see that there's going to be tariffs and further decoupling, they're starting to move their productive capacity back to the United States, or at least out of China.
Yeah, I understand that it's very difficult to manufacture in the United States because that cost of living is so high and our wages are so high in comparison. There's just no way to sell items at the cost you can purchase in China. But I do know there's alternatives, and there's Canada and even Vietnam. I mean, the quality there is far superior and the cost of living is very low, and they're able to sustain somewhat of a quality of life with the money they do make at these factories. And even Malaysia, what else? I know Russia sometimes provides for us as well. But there's a lot of companies that can do the same thing and 1,000 times better.
Oh, there really is. And I think what people don't understand is today, with the low energy costs, the low corporate tax rates, the opportunity zones that really exist all over the country, there's a tremendous capability to bring manufacturing back to the United States. But what the Chinese do are essentially use our own capital flows and other things, in terms of subsidization against us. So, they make it so anti-competitive to manufacture in the United States that nobody's willing to take that on. And really, you have to have tariffs to balance that out, to really make it so that, the anti-competitive activity that they're doing is reflected in the price of their goods through a tariff. Now, as we get to a more permanent state with regard to tariffs on Chinese products, and especially as those products are transshipped through other countries, where sometimes they'll make something and they'll ship it through Vietnam and say it was made in Vietnam. But as we begin to protect against that, then things start to equalize.
I mean, but I've purchased things from Vietnam, or it says made in Vietnam, and the quality was there. So I guess it's hard to say. And then the electronics, they don't even last. You're spending like $800, $900 on a phone last couple years. I used to think to myself, are they putting a virus in the phone so they start to collapse and not function well, so you have to go buy another phone, or is this just really cheap stuff?
Well, in a lot of cases, it's just really cheap stuff. And back in 2015, Amazon went over and started educating, Chinese how to sell on their platform. And since then, the Amazon platform has been flooded with counterfeit products, and they've really driven a lot of good young startup businesses in the United States out of business by going onto their platform on Amazon and taking sales away from them. And then, of course, the products are defective, and then the rating drops for the company because they think that they're selling poor products. Now, this is going on Shopify and eBay, so
eBay too.
and it's supported by the fact that we're a member of the postal union, and we subsidize postage for direct-to-consumer shipments coming from China. So it's cheaper to ship from China to the United States than it is if you've got that business in the United States. So these are some of the things that need to be cleaned up, need to be fixed. And once they are, it's going to be much more competitive for those companies who are operating in the United States, making high-quality products to sell in the United States.
Mm-hmm. And even if you want to become more aware of products and in trying your best not to purchase items that were made in China, it's sometimes difficult to find when you're online. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, like when I wanted the wipes and they were $50, and Amazon at that point had said they were going to not allow for that, but it was still there. I was still finding it. And it took me some research. I mean, it took a lot of time to find out that it was actually the supplier was from China. And then yesterday, I was buying my daughter a bathing suit online with a very reputable company. And I called them up to make the order because I want to ask them questions. And I'm like, are your products made in America? Where are they made at? And she said, oh, they're kind of made everywhere. They're actually made in Florida. That's where a corporate office is. And that didn't make sense to me because I know that corporate office is not necessarily where things are produced. And so I tried to reach the corporate office, but instead I went online and started doing some homework and seeing comments. And sure enough, they make products in China, although the customer service representative said otherwise.
Well, yeah, and they've had television manufacturers in the United States saying that they were manufacturing in the United States, when in actuality, there was one part that they were adding to the televisions to, have them shipped as not operating televisions, and they just, add this one part with a screw, and all of a sudden, say it's manufactured in the U.S. just so they can get around, the tariffs. There's also examples of these warehouses that are filling up both in Canada and Mexico, because if you ship a product across the border that's less than $800 in value, then that can come in tariff-free as well. So there's all kinds of ways to either classify the product differently or list the product differently or do something to the product that really makes it get around these tariffs. So we need to be much better at identifying fraud. This is going on because that, again, you can do whatever you want in China because the Chinese Communist Party allows for that as long as you're not providing problems for the party.
Mm-hmm. And then let's get into also the fact that so many of the products are poison, literally poison. People are dying from the products that are being used here in America. And even Mattel and some of the toy manufacturers are also using products from China. And babies are dying because things aren't made well, like car seats and things like that. So this is serious. Children are dying, people are dying, and it really bothers me so much that our pharmaceuticals are coming from China. That's just a recipe for disaster. There's no quality control in China. I'm going to repeat that. There's no quality control. Just like they state now, oh, we're not going to hire anybody under the age of 16. They may state that, but there's no oversight. They still do it.
No, that's so true. And, unfortunately, those same factories are used to make fentanyl. So, fentanyl comes in through the southern border direct in U.S. postal shipments and from the northern border. And it's all originating in China. So, the things that are allowed, in China in terms of those things that are harmful to people, whether it be poison or whether it be exploding, toys or things that catch on fire. I mean, the lack of rules. And then when you're in China, things like food containers. Food containers are not supposed to be recycled if they've been used. Of course, they go ahead and do it anyway. So what you find is 80 to 90% of the food containers for fast food.
We have station break. With Robert S. Spalding, and he's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute focusing on U.S.-China relations. And he is the author of Stealth War, How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept, in case you're joining us a little bit late. So let's just pick up where we left off. And basically, we're talking about consumerism, and we as Americans need to rethink how we purchase. And I personally believe, I'm going to restate this, that we have got to start opposing. We need to start reaching out to these corporations and demanding that they do not use China, or we're just not going to shop with them anymore. And people are like, oh, the products are so cheap, it's the way to do it. And I'm like, well, do you want to buy a product once or do you want to buy it twice? Because the quality, as we both know, just isn't there. So let's pick up where we left off.
Thank you.
Okay. And the other thing we can discuss too is just how much of a problem it's been with China, and most of the influenza and flus actually originate in China. The lack of sanitation. I mean, there was actually studies or reports that were brought to the Chinese government's attention that was just a cesspool, just waiting for a pandemic to occur or an outbreak, and they didn't address it, of course.
Well, there is plenty of evidence that shows that, there's been a lot of research done on infectious diseases, particularly with regard to bat-related coronaviruses, and especially those that are infectious to humans. And so, of course, we also know that the lab, our diplomats were concerned about the safety considerations at the lab. So there are certainly challenges with how the Chinese Communist Party allows for these wet markets to exist, but also there's other things that are going on, all of which are terribly problematic when it comes to the health and welfare of not just Americans, but really people everywhere.
Mm-hmm. What about this theory that they actually created the virus? I mean, it would be in their best interest for something like that to occur.
Well, I mean, we can actually, have a discussion about that, but I think it's far more interesting to talk about who created the pandemic, because, at least, you're not stuck waiting for researchers to be granted the opportunity to investigate the lab, because we actually know that Xi Jinping was directing the actions in January. We know that he was allowing for international travel while locking down domestic travel and preventing the transfer of PPE and masks to those affected areas where they were sending people that were sick from Wuhan. And so we know that the pandemic was started by the Chinese Communist Party. We know that they sought to benefit from it by hoarding and then price gouging. So, the origin of the virus, I think there's enough circumstantial evidence to point to the fact that it was most likely related to Shi Zhengzli's research with regard to gain of function in bat-related coronaviruses, but we don't know for sure. But I tell people, why does it matter if we know that they created the spread of the disease?
Mm-hmm. And then there's the SARS and the bird flu.
And in actuality, we have evidence that SARS escaped from the lab twice after
Really?
2003, and people were infected by it. Yes, so there's evidence that SARS escaped. So they have a long history of not actually abiding by rules, and in fact, in January, General Secretary Xi sought to accelerate the introduction of a biosafety law in China, most likely because of what had occurred at the laboratory. Of course, they replaced the lab director with a general officer from the People's Liberation Army that has a career in virology. So there's a lot going on in China. And if you follow if you go by if there's smoke, there's fire. There's clearly a lot of smoke.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And let's kind of move into, China's been showing off a lot of new powerful weapons, and experts think they're basically sending a message. And there's quite an extensive list here. And one of the ones that was interesting to me was this electromagnetic rail. And I've seen some photos of it, and the list goes on and on. What do you think about these powerful weapons that are coming out of China?
Well, so I think one of the things that people have to remember is that we have nuclear weapons in the United States. Now, people understand that they're very, very terrible, but they also tend to restrict the level of warfare between like-armed opponents. And so I think one of the things we have to remember is, although they're creating a lot of weapons, the likelihood of the United States and China fighting anytime soon is not very high. And that is because the risk to the regime in China, the risk to all that they have built is far too great to really want to approach that. That's why my book Stealth War, really tries to explain that the things that they try to do are really to prevent them from having the risk of going to war with the United States, but still over time, accrues benefits to the Chinese regime.
Mm-hmm. But do you want to discuss some of these in detail? Some of these weapons, it's
Sure,
frightening.
sure. DF-41 is probably one of the ones on your list there, which is a MIRVed ICBM. MIRV, multiple independently retargetable vehicles, really 10 precision nuclear warheads, an extremely dangerous weapon, created a lot of instability during the Cold War between Russia and the United States. And of course, both countries moved to demerve their missiles so the United States really went down to one warhead per missile to prevent that kind of unstable nuclear environment. And here the Chinese are creating those things. So they have essentially had a policy of minimum deterrence, which meant that they were going to have just enough nuclear weapons to create damage. That type weapon, a MIRVed ICBM, is not a minimum deterrence weapon. It's much more damaging as an offensive weapon than just as a second strike capability.
Mm-hmm. And what's your opinion on Hong Kong right now? I interviewed a journalist who was there, and those protests were very large in comparison to some of the other protests going on. And it went on for, I don't know if it's still going on, but it's been going on for quite some time.
So what I said a year ago was that the Chinese Communist Party was going to take back Hong Kong. I actually wrote a report for the Defense Department, and that's because when they tore up the trade deal you could see at that point that the Chinese Communist Party was ready to isolate itself and decouple from the world, because it ran the risk when it tore up that deal that the president would completely walk away from the table and further cut them off. Of course, we went back and had a phase one trade deal, and with this idea that we were going to go to phase two. But, at the end of the day, at that point, the Chinese regime, the Chinese Communist Party, had decided that they were going to go a different way. And so what's going on in Hong Kong is a continuation of a policy that was started by Xi Jinping. I think in December, the Chinese Communist Party announced during the fourth plenum that they were going to subjugate the Hong Kong people. So all of this has been happening under the cover of coronavirus, and it's just going to result in Hong Kong, being lost to the free world.
That's so unfortunate.
It's unfortunate for the Hong Kong people, sure.
It is. It really is. My heart goes out to them. And I know quite a bit about that, and it's just heartbreaking. They're supposed to be an independent sovereign.
They really are, and
country.
They signed a treaty with the UK, and that was supposed to be for 50 years that Hong Kong would remain independent. They've abrogated the treaty, and clearly, but the Chinese Communist Party doesn't, fulfill any of its agreements. It's just it is notorious for saying one thing and doing the other. This is no different.
Mm-hmm. What do you think the Chinese people think about America?
Well, for the most part, the Chinese people like America. That being said, they, after the Tiananmen massacre, the Chinese Communist Party instituted forced indoctrination, control of the media, control of the internet. And so nowadays, the Chinese are so controlled, and Chinese people are so controlled in what they can know. They really don't know their own history. They don't know, they're fed a lot of xenophobia, and it really is, it's very difficult for them to see America in a different light. In fact, Li Yuan, who's a reporter at the New York Times, writes about influence in the age of Instagram, as an article she wrote for the New York Times about a year ago. Her journey for deprogramming herself from all the Chinese propaganda that she had been fed as a citizen of China. So it is really difficult for them because they never have seen anything different, and they've been constantly told that the United States is evil, but they still like coming and visiting the United States. It's just they have been conditioned to believe that, China could never be a democracy. They could never have freedom. The Chinese Communist Party is the only thing that can return China to its former glory, and that the West, including the United States and Japan, all they want to do is subjugate the Chinese people. This is what they're taught, and so it is hard for them to understand that the United States is a democracy. It does value freedom, and it wants nothing like the subjugation of the Chinese people. But that's the difficulty that we face.
Mm-hmm. And then China has tried to revamp their image, so to speak, and they built more roads, and they're trying to make it easier to transport and travel, but that's really for their own benefit.
Well, of course it is. It's connecting their economy to resources and connecting those economies to their supply chain. So it's really about creating this very one-sided, beneficial relationship for the purpose of maintaining the Chinese Communist Party in power and enriching the senior leaders of the Chinese Communist Party.
What do you think about the leaders? Do you have any other comments about them? I don't know that much about them. I haven't researched them thoroughly. Maybe a couple of the people. So what can you say about some of the people in charge?
So I mean, they are some of the most professionally trained liars in terms of diplomacy that you'll ever meet. They're very, very calculating. They're very shrewd. They're very well trained. They understand what their strategy is, and they are a Leninist regime, and so that means that they operate very much like a criminal organization in terms of how they operate. Very secretive, and you are part of the inner circle, or you're not. And if you're not, then it's very difficult to penetrate that organization and understand what's going on. Most people don't know that China has two constitutions: the People's Republic of China Constitution and the Chinese Communist Party Constitution. And the one that governs China, the one that controls the banks and the police and the borders, is the Chinese Communist Party.
Mm-hmm. And I know people have tried to write about what's going on in China, but there's repercussions. Even Sweden had interviewed a prisoner who had escaped to Sweden, and then China threatened to not do business with them. And they basically are strong arming the countries that are speaking out about them.
Yeah, and I was talking to my Swedish counterparts when I was in Beijing as a defense attaché, and I think at that time we could both begin to understand that China was a far different thing than what we'd been led to believe, and the Chinese Communist Party was really, really an evil regime.
Mm-hmm. What do you think their end game is?
Well, their end game is to stay in control, and their end game is to stay in control by providing the kind of resources to the Chinese people that ensures that they won't want to revolt. And what I've been saying is, as long as we're giving them innovation, technology, talent, and capital, they're going to continue to have a stranglehold over the Chinese people, because we're essentially strengthening their hand. Every time, for everything that we do with them, everything that we give them, we're strengthening their hand. That makes it easier for them to oppress the Chinese people. And thankfully, the president today said we're going to stop doing that. So this is an important development. The president, first Secretary Pompeo said they're not sufficiently autonomous. The president just announced that we're going to start unwinding the special privileges that Hong Kong had. Now, that special privilege allowed the Chinese Communist Party access to our capital markets to get hundreds of billions of dollars to build their power, to build islands in the South China Sea, to build the Belt and Road Initiative. All of that is going to go away. So I think it's an incredibly important development that happened today.
Yeah, well, we have a responsibility as a nation and as human beings to thwart some of what's going on. The corporations just have to start thinking about what China has done historically and even currently, and stop thinking about the bottom line. And I know the stock markets control a lot of that. The corporations and the companies that are, it's about the bottom line.
It is, and in organizations like the Morgan Stanley Capital International Index, which really drives a lot of investment, going from 0 to 20% in Chinese equities, in spite of the fact that they don't have to do audit or transparency requirements like American companies, is part of the problem. And of course, our retirement funds have been heavily invested in Chinese companies. So, they're not only were the regular employees using regular employees' retirement funds, they were also trying to use military members' retirement funds to go buy stocks in companies that build weapons for the Chinese. So this is how preposterous this situation and relationship has become. But, thankfully, the current president, President Trump, has finally started to do something. I served under Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump, and I'll tell you, of all of them, Trump is finally the first one to actually do something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And to kind of circle back a little bit about the products, one thing I did want to talk about, because I'm an animal rights activist as well, is what happens to animals. Not only do they eat animals that they shouldn't, like dogs, they skin their animals alive. That is so disturbing to me on so many levels. And the other thing is the pet food. A great portion of the pet food comes out of China as well, and animals are dying. There's contaminants and in the vegetable proteins, and it's so horrible. And like this company, one of the companies that I always had a lot of faith in was Royal Canine, and that was for a lot of purebred animals, and a lot of the breeders were using it, and animals are dying from that food, or had died in the recent past.
Yes, and of course, my wife and I, we don't buy any products for our pets that are in China, and we try to the greatest extent possible, buy products that aren't manufactured in China, because we're supporting this regime, and certainly those corporations that manufacture in China, should be doing whatever it takes to move their manufacturing out and stop supporting that regime.
So we as individuals should be reaching out, hopefully in an overwhelming way, to the corporations, and even Nike, even though they said they were pulling out of China, to this day, I did a little research this morning, they're still using China. So I still believe that we the people have a voice, and I count on that. And we have to reach out to these companies through letters, emails, whatever you need to do, petitions, to show them that we are not going to use their products if they're going to continue to use China as a manufacturer.
Well, absolutely. And I think the more that happens, the more these companies will realize that, their fortune doesn't lie with China, doesn't lie with the Chinese Communist Party, but rather it lies with the United States in promoting and protecting our freedoms and preventing the oppression and brutalization of, the Chinese people and others.
Yeah. And I guess when I first started hearing about this and some of these horrible things happening, I actually thought it was just sensationalized, or I thought it was just human rights to the extreme. I didn't, like I said, I just had a very difficult time believing that human beings were capable of this. But, now I'm awake and I'm aware there's evil out in the world. And again, it's not the Chinese people themselves. So these hate crimes have to stop.
Yeah,
We're
they
no
really,
better than them.
really do.
We're,
They really,
yeah.
really, really do.
We're supposed to hold human rights at high value. We have the Bill of Rights in our Constitution, and it does not reflect well on us as a country to behave that way. You're behaving like animals.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So, how about your book? Let's go back to your book. What have we not covered today that's in your book that you feel that's important to convey to the audience?
Well, I think what's important to convey is that, we need to start looking at investing in our own nation, in infrastructure and manufacturing and science and technology and STEM education, and that we need to build this secure internet for the American people. We lose so much of our data, and the goal of the Chinese Communist Party is to become the Saudi Arabia of data. So they want to have their data and our data because they know it drives artificial intelligence. It's really what the fuel of artificial intelligence, and they seek to dominate artificial intelligence going forward, and automation and all of those technologies that are really advanced 21st century, data-driven technologies. And so it's up to us to go a different way, to think differently about national security. It's not just about planes and ships and tanks. It's also about our internet. And so this is something that we're going to have to really work hard on.
Mm-hmm. And even your apps. I found an article, someone sent it to me because people send me very informative articles, and even one of my children, or some of my children, were using these apps, and they're very popular. I think it was Likely and a couple other apps, and they're data gathering through these popular social network apps that our children use.
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of 5G is really, from the Chinese perspective, to gather all the data they can about you. And 5G is really about taking the data out of the smartphone and putting it into the city. So rather than just having to track you on your smartphone, say you want to get rid of the smartphone because you're tired of being tracked by the Chinese Communist Party or Google or whoever it is, with 5G, the city is going to be tracking you. So it'll know everything about you, and that data will be available to not only the tech companies, but also China. So this is the challenge of democracy going into the digital world, where if you don't know who's oppressing you or that you're being oppressed, because it's unknown to you that you're being influenced through your social media or other forums, that this idea that the Second Amendment is going to protect your freedom, it only works when you know that your freedom is being taken from you. And that's the whole point of the internet, and certainly the current mobile information economy is to influence you to do things without you actually know you're being influenced. And that's the power that China has essentially got their hands on and is trying to deploy around the world.
We just have another minute here. So you have to maintain vigilance, and you really do need to research where your products are coming from for the safety of your family even. And we can't be hypocrites and allow this to happen. And you do need to reach out. You need to refuse to purchase items that are manufactured in China. And Amazon's hiding it, fairly well. It's making me inclined not to use Amazon as much, but with the COVID-19, most of us were shopping on Amazon. So we really have to take a stance by not buying at all from these companies.
Absolutely.
And so again, we just have a minute left. So let's talk about your book, where you can buy it, any websites you want to share, any information you'd like to share. This is time to do it.
Yes, so generalspalding.com